Yes, it's coming up now.
Okay. Let me welcome everyone to the Education, Health, and Environmental Affairs Committee. Hopefully people are staying warm and not snow covered. Today we're going to begin with a fiscal briefing 1 o'clock from Mr. Romans. Then following that at 2 o'clock, we will start our bill hearings. Today we have 8 bills, I believe. And in fact, the witness list is not super long, so hopefully we can get to other responsibilities with our constituents as well. With that, Mr. Romans, you want to start? Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're going to share a screen so you can see the document that I'm going to present from. We're going to give you kind of a quick overview of the budget, and then I'm happy to answer any questions the committee has. So let's go ahead and share the screen. Great.
Thank you. Okay,
so here on the first page, right at the top, you can see the governor's budget proposal for fiscal 22. There's a little more than $49 billion in it. It's actually a decrease of about $1 billion from the current fiscal year. The reason for the big decrease is because federal funds go down, and there's really 2 reasons for that. One is the SNAP program, which provides food assistance to lower income individuals, is expected to receive less federal money in fiscal 22 because it's assumed that the caseload will drop as the economy recovers from the pandemic. And that accounts for close to $1 billion of the decrease in federal funding. And the other reason is we received a lot of federal CARES Act money, some of which is in the fiscal 2021 budget, and would be kind of one-time spending, goes away in fiscal 22. It's worth noting that none of the December congressional stimulus money is included in the budget at this point. There's likely to be 1.3 billion or so of federal dollars that will eventually pass through the state budget in fiscal 21 and 22 from that stimulus. The governor's budget team has indicated they will submit a supplemental budget later in session, adding much of that money. And of course, there's also no assumptions about any money from President Biden's proposed stimulus. If something passes later in session, you could see a very significant additional supplemental budget adding that money. So the budget you see at the end of session may be quite a bit different than what you see right now, given how much federal funding might come along before the end of session. All right, let's turn to the next page. I guess I should say just first off, the governor's budget plan leaves almost 200 million in fund balance at the end of fiscal 22, and he leaves a rainy day fund balance of close to $1 billion, about 5% of general fund revenues. Now, perhaps the biggest initiative, if you will, in the governor's plan is tax relief proposals, and those are outlined in that chart at the top of the page. And they really break into 2 groupings. So first is the Relief Act, and these Relief Act components are all in the budget and tax version of the bill that is on the Senate floor right now. So the 3 big things that affect the budget are, 1, repealing the income tax on unemployment benefits, and that's a permanent change, not just a temporary one. You can see that would reduce general fund revenues in both 21 and 22. The second component is a stimulus payment to people who received the earned income tax credit in tax year 2019 or will receive it in this tax season for tax year 2020. The maximum stimulus payment you can get if you receive the EITC in both years is $750 for a family, $450 for an individual. The third component is the sales tax vendor credit. So businesses collect the sales tax on behalf of the state when they make sales, and then they remit it to the state. The governor's proposal is to let them keep up to $3,000 a month for a 4-month period, which would start the month after the bill passes. So a business could end up retaining about $12,000 of the sales tax revenue that they collect. It is capped at businesses with sales of 100,000 in a month. So very large businesses, online retailers making really substantial sales would not qualify for it to retain that money. And then there's a second set of tax relief measures that you've seen before. They relate to military retirement income, hometown heroes, expanding the research and development tax credit. And then the big one that doesn't have a fiscal impact on this chart is phasing out the income tax on retirement income beginning in fiscal 23. When that's fully implemented, that would cost us about 300 million plus in general fund revenues on an annual basis. So, and each of those will be their own bills. The Relief Act up the top there contains those three big fiscal impacts. Then you'll see smaller bills on these other items. So overall, it reduces general fund revenues by about 617 million in fiscal 21. And if adopted for fiscal 22, would reduce revenues by about 52 million. So how does the governor balance the budget while cutting all these taxes? Well, the chart at the bottom of the page tries to, at a really high level, answer that question. Before taking into account the tax proposals and the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act that the governor has proposed, the budget would be out of balance for fiscal 22 by about 188 million. And then we've layered in the various tax proposals that impact 21 and 22. And then the governor brings it all together with that Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, which contains over 1 billion in budget balancing actions. About 826 million of those actions are budget reductions. That sounds like a very big number. It's worth noting 422 million of those cuts are actually just putting less money into the rainy day fund than is required by statute. But even doing that, the governor still leaves about $1 billion in the rainy day fund. The other big reduction in the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act relates to the Maryland Health Benefit Exchange. They have a reinsurance fund, which the General Assembly created a couple of years back. And it's used to help keep the costs of the individual market down so that more people will enroll in health insurance. The bulk of the money for that program comes from the federal funds. And in fact, federal funding is covering all of the costs of the program at the moment, which means we're building up a significant state fund balance. It's about 400 million currently. So the governor wants to take 100 million in each fiscal 21 and 22 from that fund and use it to support Medicaid instead, which replaces general funds for Medicaid. The other key components of the balancing plan are transfers and revenues in the BRFA. The biggest one is about 200 million of transfers and revenues are all temporary. The biggest is diverting 101 million of the transfer tax revenues for fiscal 22 to the general fund. The governor does backfill that with bonds in the capital budget so that all of the transfer tax programs are fully funded in fiscal 22. All right, let's go to the next slide. This chart at the top of the next page shows you the structural budget outlook for fiscal 22 through fiscal 26. This is a DLS estimate. So structural budget outlook, a little different than cash balance. It's whether ongoing revenues are adequate to pay for ongoing spending. And for fiscal 22, we're very close, about 76 million out of structural balance. This is much better than we've seen in most of the last 20 years. And then the outlook for the subsequent years is in the $400 to $500 million gap each year. Now this takes into account the governor's tax relief proposals, including phasing out the income tax on retirement income. If you were to remove that from this forecast, we'd be very close to structurally balanced in fiscal 25 and 26, which again is a departure from where we've been in many of the recent years. So the long-term outlook for the state is it's not great because we still have a structural gap, but it is better than we've seen in recent times. The bottom of the page goes through, and I'll hit a few of the highlights, kind of some of the key elements of the governor's budget plan. K through 12 education. So the governor has fully funded all of the education formulas. He's also sort of overfunded things in two ways. He's used the Blueprint Fund to fund two big initiatives. One, 214 million to hold the school systems harmless for the enrollment declines that they experienced this year. Overall enrollment in the state is down more than 2%, and that would have resulted in education aid declining through many of the formulas in fiscal 22. So the 214 million holds everybody harmless, and each county gets a small increase actually over the prior year. The second initiative of the governor's is also funded out of the Blueprint Fund, 152 million to pay for supplemental instruction and tutoring in fiscal 22. This is designed to respond to the learning loss concerns during the pandemic. In terms of healthcare providers, the governor has decided to accelerate a planned 4% rate increase. Instead of funding it effective July 1 of this year, he's funded it effective January 1 of this year. So that's providers serving the developmentally disabled, behavioral health providers, as well as many of the providers serving the Medicaid population. And then for some of the lower income people in the state who receive the temporary cash assistance benefit, the governor has temporarily increased the benefit by $100 per month per individual for 6 months, January through June of this calendar year. Next slide. Just a couple of other things to mention. Local aid. So most local aid funding is fully funded with the formulas. The one big exception is community colleges. Community colleges were supposed to get about a 41 million increase. That's like more than 12%. The governor has decided to slow that growth to a little over 5%. So they get 14 million instead of 41 million of growth. Now that's an action taken in the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act. So the General Assembly has an opportunity to adjust that if it is not satisfied with the governor's plan. In higher education, University System of Maryland, in-state tuition is being held to 2% growth. One notable cut that the governor is proposing is for the Selinger formula for the non-public higher ed institutions. He's level funding them. They were supposed to get a 30 million increase, which is a very substantial increase for that program. And again, that's a Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act action. Just talk for a minute about state employees. There is no broad-based general salary increase in the budget for fiscal 22. However, there are a couple of provisions that would raise some state employees' salaries. The law enforcement officers have negotiated a 4% general salary increase, and they'll also get merit increases in fiscal 22. And then a couple of the bargaining units have agreed with the administration that if revenues in the current year exceed the current estimate by a certain amounts, that they would get a bonus of $500 and a 1% salary increase next April. Notably absent from these agreements with the administration is AFSCME, which is the largest bargaining unit in the state. They have not reached agreement with the administration and currently would get no increases even if revenues do over-attain the estimates. On the capital budget, there's 1.1 billion of bonds in the governor's capital budget. That's consistent with the Spending Affordability Committee's recommendation. And the governor is supplementing that with 244 million of bond premium that'll support even more projects. Despite all this funding, there is no money set aside for legislative bond initiatives. So the Budget and Tax Committee will have to find room in the capital budget to fund legislative initiatives. I should note in the capital budget, there's about 313 million for school construction. In addition, the governor's got 520 million of revenue bonds related to the Built to Learn Act, which would become law if the Kerwin veto is overridden. As I understand it, the governor is also planning to introduce his own Built to Learn Act, following along with his assumption that the bill remains vetoed. Let's skip to the next slide, and we can skip ahead. So the next 2 pages here go through all of the items in the governor's plan that require legislation. I've talked about most of the highlights on this page. The top part again shows you all the revenue actions. You can see some of the big cuts in the lower half of the page, that rainy day fund cut of 422 million. Let's go to the next slide. And then I mentioned up at the top of this page, the 2 biggest sort of policy-oriented cuts, the Selinger formula and the CATE formula, the private colleges and the community colleges, getting significant reductions to planned growth. And then you can see smaller reductions for a variety of other programs. I think that's really all to say about that. Let's skip the next slide and keep going. All right, so I thought would be interest to this committee is to talk about the Blueprint Fund for a moment. So we try to do 2 things in this chart. The first part of the chart shows you the status of the Blueprint Fund if the veto override the veto stands, if it's not overridden. And I think the important lines are the second and third lines there, the Education Trust Fund lockbox revenue and the Blueprint revenue. And it shows you the annual amounts that are being set aside for education enhancements under current law. And you can see by fiscal 23, you're getting over $1 billion being set aside between the lockbox and the Blueprint revenues, and that continues in the out years. So you have a substantial amount of revenue dedicated to education enhancements. And with the veto in place, though, beyond fiscal 22 and what the governor has proposed for 22, there's very little in terms of mandated education enhancements in law. So absent any legislative action, you would build up a huge fund balance in the Blueprint Fund as the money would just go unspent. And you can see by fiscal 26, it would be $4.8 billion sitting there. Now, obviously, you can either spend that money on something or divert it to some other purpose. But the second part of the chart shows you, well, what happens if you do override the Kerwin veto? And we take into account 3 bills in this analysis. The first is the sales tax and digital downloads, which was passed last year, which would apply the sales tax to digital downloads and generate nearly $100 million a year in revenue starting in fiscal 22. And the other 2 bills that we account for are obviously the Blueprint for Maryland's Future bill, as well as the Bill to Learn Act, which becomes law if the Blueprint veto is overridden. And those 2 bills combined would increase spending by about $1 billion in fiscal 23, growing to $1.7 billion in fiscal 26. The bottom line here is that ending balance line, the second from the bottom in bold, which shows you, if you override the vetoes, what the fund balance in the Blueprint fund is at the end of each year. And you can see you actually can fund all of the Blueprint plans through fiscal 25 with the revenues you've dedicated to education enhancements. In fiscal 26, you would need to supplement those revenues with some general funds, about $195 million. And if we were to roll this forward into 27 and 28, the number would get over $500 million a year pretty quickly and grow from there. But in the near term, the veto override does not really alter the budget outlook for the state. Let's go to the next slide. This slide just shows you how the Blueprint money that was in the 21 budget was allocated, and then how the governor is allocating it in 22. I've really hit on the 2 big enhancements. You can see that hold harmless money and the transitional supplemental instruction being enhanced. And you can see there's a decrease for pre-K supplemental grants. That's because enrollment has declined. It's not a policy decision. It just reflects fewer children enrolled in pre-K right now. And then there's a small enhancement in the early education for a variety of programs. And you can see declining enrollment grants go down, but they're subsumed within that hold harmless grant amount. So that's kind of the picture on the Blueprint. Let's skip the next 2 slides. And the last topic I wanted to talk about, and then I'd rather just answer questions that you have, is the federal stimulus. So this chart shows you we received about $30 billion of federal stimulus money between the CARES Act and some other bills that were passed last spring, and then the December stimulus. And the blue bars show you the CARES Act, the yellow bars show you the December stimulus money. The vast majority of that $30 billion went to business assistance, mainly through the Paycheck Protection Program. But you can see other policy areas also got substantial sums, including health, which is getting close to $4 billion, which makes sense in the pandemic, of course. Transportation over on the far right, over $2 billion, more than half of that goes to WMATA. And then you can see, significant amounts in a number of other policy areas. I would note in K through 12 schools, the December stimulus provides $770 million that will go directly to the school systems themselves. There's another $85 million or so that MSDE can set aside and either send out to the school systems or use for state level initiatives. So a substantial amount of money going to the school systems. And let's go to the next slide. Yeah, and this just shows you the detail on the December stimulus, which is money that really hasn't hit the economy yet. You can see there was quite a bit going into higher education for public four-year institutions getting $154 million. The community colleges getting $120 million. The private colleges getting about $35 million. You can see that K through 12 education, that $869 million includes the $770 going to the school systems, and then the money I mentioned MSDE can set aside. Some smaller amounts that the governor gets to allocate. Then there's a big chunk of money for rental assistance. For the larger jurisdictions, those with population over 200,000, that goes directly to the jurisdictions to use. And you can see smaller amounts in various other areas, as well as near the bottom there, the business assistance, the paycheck protection gets nearly $5 billion and more aid. One other thing I would note about the federal assistance is, in addition to what I showed in these 2 charts, there's about $8 billion in unemployment benefits that the federal government has paid over the last year, and more than $1 billion of SNAP enhancements that have gone out. So we've gotten close to $40 billion of federal money to help boost our economy during the pandemic. So, Mr. Chairman, that's really all I was going to talk about. I'm happy to take any questions you or the members have.
Thank you. Let's start with Vice Chairman. Senator Kagan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, David, and for your whole career of so many years of working on the state budget and all your expertise. I had a question going back to Kerwin and the veto. I have two questions that are related. One is, it seems to me like what I heard was you gave the scenario of if the governor's veto is sustained. And so you didn't give another scenario of if the veto is overridden. And related to that, you mentioned the $214 million put aside to compensate for attendance shortfalls as a result of coronavirus, and 151.6 million for of blueprint money that's been set aside for blueprint enhancement for tutoring and stuff, which I suspect we all believe that it is important. Can you just talk through, please, what happens if the veto is overridden and what would happen to those two line items?
I'll start with those two line items. The veto override would not impact fiscal 22, the budget the governor proposed. So what he's proposed is in the budget. The legislature, like it always does, has a chance to review it and could, reduce it if it wanted or fence the money for slightly different purposes. But that money is essentially in the budget. It wouldn't be impacted at all by the veto override. If you do override the veto, the point of the chart really was to try to get across that actually you have enough money in the blueprint fund and in the lockbox to pay for the veto override through fiscal 25. You don't need more general funds. You already have the cash set aside. In fiscal 26, there would need to be some additional general funds added, about 200 million, to help fully fund that Kerwin proposal. But in the near term, it's quite affordable in term with the money you've already set aside to pay
And
for.
the 214, sorry, just to follow up, the 214 million and the 151.6 million then would not affect out years saving up so that we can afford the blueprint?
I mean, if you didn't do them, you just would have more money in fiscal 26 and you wouldn't need a general fund subsidy, but they don't negatively affect the next few years at all.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, before I go on to the next question, David, so the middle of this chart includes the diversion of the 360 million for the items Senator Kagan just spoke about?
They're already, yes, they're accounted for. Yes.
Okay. Okay, let me go to Senator Riley, followed by Senator Ellis.
Mr. Roman, if you would go to page 2. I'm interested in drilling down just a little bit on the phase out of retirement income tax. First, other tax changes, fourth one down. I think I know what it means, but please elaborate a little more. What does that phrase mean?
I have not seen the bill yet, but the concept, as I understand it, is that we would stop taxing retirement income and we would phase that in over multiple years.
And you don't have any details yet if it's.
I don't have any details.
Okay, that's fine. Now, if you go to page 14, you had a indication of rental assistance.
Yes.
It's under standalone rental assistance, emergency assistance for renters. Now that'll be allocated to each individual county for administration. Are there any parameters on how those dollars are used? Do you know?
Yes, the federal law, I believe it's 80% of the median income in the state is the cap on who can get it, which is pretty high in Maryland. So it's pretty broadly applicable to Marylanders. It can be used both for past due rent, people have built up some balances, as well as to help people for up to a 12-month period.
Are these direct payments to these folks or payments? Do you know if the program requires direct payment to the tenant, or is it authorizing a payment to the landlord on behalf of a tenant? Do you know that?
I have not seen the detail on how it will actually get paid out.
Okay, very good. Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Senator Ellis, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Romans, thank you for these great numbers. I have a question. I might be almost there with the hold harmless grants. Is that tied into the reduced enrollment because of COVID, or just the school system losing students overall, minus COVID?
It's really benefiting school systems either way. I mean, the primary impetus is because all but one school system in the state lost enrollment this year. It certainly seems like a lot of that enrollment decline was due to the pandemic, but you're right. Some counties were already having enrollment declines. All of the counties that will benefit for whatever the reason for their enrollment decline.
And what was, I apologize, I should have been more detailed like Senator Riley and keeping track of the page numbers. I'll do that next time, Senator Riley, but that was great. What page was that? I thought there were two references. One was to the Hold Harmless grant, and another one, okay, thank you, page 10, Hold Harmless grant. In 2022 of, I guess, 213 million. Is there also a separate line item for return funds to the schools because of the COVID pandemic? I don't know if I missed that, or all of it is in this number right here.
This is all of the state money that's going to hold them harmless for the enrollment declines. They would have lost under the formulas, which are not shown here because they're not funded with the blueprint. They would have lost, roughly 200 million or so of funding just because the enrollment was down, and this offsets that.
But Senator Ellis, if I could, the December federal support, which has not been distributed, includes $770 million for K-12 education. So that is another potential amount of money that'll be going to the 24 jurisdictions. Is that correct, David?
That is absolutely correct, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Okay, let me ask you a couple of questions on that very same topic. The 770 million ultimately goes to the 24 jurisdictions. Does it pass through the state, and can the state direct how that money is spent?
The state has no role in directing the funding. It's allocated to the school systems based on Title I, and the federal law gives pretty broad parameters on how they can use it. It's mainly to respond to the impacts of the pandemic on the school systems, but it's fairly broad in terms of what they can use it for. And like I say, the state really has no role in directing that money.
So the possibility of that money going to the Hold Harmless and freeing up that state money for other purposes, is that an option?
Well, the state can certainly, make the policy decision that, hey, you, the school systems, have received 770 million. You don't need the Hold Harmless money, and we'd like to use that differently or save it for the future. I think that's a reasonable approach the state could take.
Okay, and to another question, which we've all been dancing around. As you stated, the governor's veto of Kerwin allowed him to not put Kerwin funding in the 22 budget. If we wanted to stay on the timeline of Kerwin, is there a way we could direct the expenditures be spent if the money's available, which I think you've implied it is, to get started for July 1, 2022, despite it not being in the governor's budget?
Well, I guess there's a couple ways to answer that. One is obviously that he has put some enhancements in, like the Hold Harmless, which was not part of the Kerwin bill. So you could fence that money and say he should use it for, the purposes of the Kerwin bill instead.
And we would do that through the supplemental?
You could do that through the budget bill. You could just attach language saying the money should be used for, whatever purposes you want. Short of that, in terms of the state funding, the governor has to appropriate the money. So you can encourage him to do so, but you don't have any hammer to make him add. He has more money he could add, but you can't make him do that to fund the, other parts of the Kerwin bill in fiscal 22. Obviously, if you override the veto, you will be able to mandate it for the subsequent years.
Well, if it's overridden, which I think we expect it to be, so then budget year 23 becomes year one of Kerwin.
Right.
And he would have to follow the mandated expenditures as laid out in that 10-year phase-in. Is
Correct.
that right?
Right.
Okay. Thank you, David. Other questions, committee members? I'm not sure we received the handout. Is that electronically being sent us? So we'll all have a copy of the document you've walked us through, David?
Yeah, we will send it to your staff so you all can have a copy.
Great. Okay, seeing no further questions, that took a lot less time than we expected. Unfortunately, we've advertised a 2 o'clock start time for the hearings. And it's been suggested to me that for the public, we should keep to that schedule. So we will reconvene in 29 minutes. As I said, we've got 8 bills. They should go fairly rapidly. That being said, this concludes the fiscal briefing for the EHE committee, and we'll see you all and those following us on YouTube in about 28 or 29 minutes. So we're adjourned.